Welcome to the January 2021 edition of the OPEC Monthly Oil Market Report, MOMR. Today we would like to present a short overview of the key highlights of the report, as well as the main changes and revisions from last month. We also invite you to view or download the complete version of our MOMR, which can be accessed on OPEC's official website at www.opec.org. It provides comprehensive coverage of oil market developments over the past month, as well as a detailed view of what our expert analysts forecast for the months to come. Global economic growth was revised up slightly for 2020 after a better-than-expected performance in the third quarter. As a result, the global economy is now expected to contract by 4.1% in 2020 compared to the previous month's forecast of minus 4.2%. While the 2021 forecast remains at 4.4%, recent news of fiscal stimulus in the US and the likelihood of a stronger than anticipated recovery in Asian economies provide potential upsides for this year's growth prospects. US economic growth in 2020 was revised slightly higher by 0.1 percentage point to show a contraction of 3.5%, while the 2021 forecast remains at 3.4%. The Eurozone forecast was also adjusted slightly higher by 0.1 percentage point to minus 7.2%, while the 2021 growth forecast remains at 3.7%. Japan's figures remain unchanged, contracting by 5.2% in 2020, followed by growth of 2.8% in 2021. China's economic growth remains at 2% in 2020 and at 6.9% in 2021. India is now expected to have seen a shallower contraction of 9% in 2020 compared to a previously forecast minus 9.2%. Expected growth in 2021 remains at 6.8%. Brazil's economy is now estimated to have contracted by 5.2%, revised up from the previous expectation of minus 5.8%, while forecast growth in 2021 remains at 2.4%. Russia's economy is seen contracting by 4.1% in 2020, compared to the previous forecast of minus 4.5%, while forecast growth in 2021 remains unchanged at 2.9%. World oil demand growth in 2020 was revised marginally higher from last month's report and is now estimated to have declined by 9.8 million barrels per day year on year to average 90 million barrels per day in 2020. OECD America, led by the US, was revised lower, particularly in the second half of 2020, amid a sluggish recovery in transportation fuels. In the non-OECD region, oil demand growth was revised higher in 2020, mainly reflecting better-than-expected demand in China and India. Strong petrochemical feedstock demand, along with a healthy uptick in gasoline requirements, supported the upward revision in both countries. For 2021, global oil demand is forecast to increase by 5.9 million barrels per day year on year to average 95.9 million barrels per day. The growth forecast was kept unchanged compared to last month's assessment. In the OECD region, oil consumption is estimated to increase by 2.6 million barrels per day year on year, but will still lag pre-pandemic levels. OECD Americas is estimated to increase the most amid a rebound in transportation fuels. In the non-OECD region, oil demand is estimated to increase by 3.3 million barrels per day year on year, driven by China, followed by India and other Asia, and supported by a rebound in economic activities. Non-OPEC liquids production in 2020 is estimated to average 62.7 million barrels per day, representing a contraction of 2.5 million barrels per day year on year. This is unchanged from the previous report, despite several upward and downward revisions in the production of various countries in the fourth quarter 2020. The oil supply forecast for the US and Brazil was revised down, while the figures for Canada and Russia were adjusted higher due to better-than-expected output in the fourth quarter 2020. The contraction in 2020 is driven mainly by Russia, the US, Canada and the UK, while production in Norway, Brazil, China and Guyana is expected to increase. The forecast for non-OPEC supply in 2021 also remains unchanged, with growth expected at 0.8 million barrels per day. The upward revision in US supply offset the downward revision in the supply forecast for Russia. Market conditions have improved for US shale, as oil prices have moved into a range where output is likely to recover at a higher than expected rate in the second half of 2021. As a result, the US liquids supply forecast was revised up by around 0.1 to average just under 18 million barrels per day, representing year-on-year growth of 0.4 million barrels per day, although uncertainties remain. The main contributors to supply growth are expected to be the US, Canada, Brazil and Norway. OPEC crude oil production increased by 278,000 barrels per day in December month-on-month to average 25.36 million barrels per day, according to secondary sources. Production increased mostly in Libya, Iraq and the UAE, while it declined mainly in Nigeria, Angola and Congo. Preliminary November data saw total OECD commercial oil stocks down by 24.5 million barrels month-on-month. At 3,104 million barrels, they were 205.1 million barrels higher than the same time 1 year ago and 163.1 million barrels above the latest 5-year average. Within the components, crude and product stocks declined month-on-month by 11.2 million barrels and 13.3 million barrels respectively. At 1,546 million barrels, OECD crude stocks are 98.4 million barrels higher than the same time a year ago and 72.6 million barrels above the latest 5-year average. Total product inventories stood at 1,558 million barrels, 106.7 million barrels above the same time a year ago and 90.5 million barrels higher than the latest 5-year average. In terms of days of forward cover, OECD commercial stocks fell month-on-month by 1.6 days in November to stand at 70.5 days. This is 8.8 days above the November 2019 level and 8.5 days above the latest 5-year average. Within the regions, OECD Americas stood at 74 million barrels above the latest 5-year average, and OECD Europe witnessed a surplus of 96 million barrels. Meanwhile, OECD Asia-Pacific inventories showed a deficit of around 8 million barrels compared with the latest 5-year average. It should be noted that the overhang in November 2020 is 137 million barrels lower since the end of December 2016, when the implementation of the Declaration of Cooperation was initiated. Demand for OPEC crude in 2020 remained unchanged from the previous month to stand at 22.2 million barrels per day, which is around 7.1 million barrels per day lower than in 2019. According to secondary sources, OPEC crude production averaged 28.2 million barrels per day in the first quarter 2020, which is about 7.3 million barrels per day higher than demand for OPEC crude. In the second quarter 2020, OPEC crude production averaged 25.6 million barrels per day, which is 9 million barrels per day higher than demand for OPEC crude. In the third quarter 2020, OPEC crude production averaged 23.8 million barrels per day, which is 0.8 million barrels per day lower than demand for OPEC crude. In the fourth quarter 2020, OPEC crude production averaged 24.9 million barrels per day, which is 1.6 million barrels per day lower than demand for OPEC crude. Demand for OPEC crude in 2021 remained unchanged from the previous month to stand at 27.2 million barrels per day, which is around 5 million barrels per day higher than in 2020. Thank you for joining us for this overview of the key highlights and changes as featured in the January 2021 issue of the OPEC Monthly Oil Market Report. For more detailed information on this and other reports, please visit our website at www.opec.org. We appreciate your interest and look forward to you joining us again for the next edition of the MOMR, which will be published on the 12th of February 2021. Until then, goodbye.